right, everybody, we are here with our latest episode of ThreatCon 1, the podcast, the place to talk about emerging threats with the people who matter. My co-host today, my good friend Patrick Garrity.
What's up? It's good to see you, Tom, as always.
Good to see you, man. We're back again for another episode. Super pumped today. My friend and our guest today, Nabil Hannan, Field CISO at NetSPI, is gracing us today. So, Nabil, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Super cool. And we're super pumped to dig into some awesome stuff with you today. What's really interesting is, we both live, all three of us live in the States, and Nabil and I have met a couple of times, most recently in Paris, of all places. And that was my first trip to Paris for the KKR CISO Summit.
Yeah, that was fun.
Definitely a fun time.
Except for the airport. I'm not a fan of the airport in Paris, but everything else was great.
Yeah, I've only flown through Paris in the past, and it was when we were on this gigantic family trip to Italy. So we flew through Charles de Gaulle to get to Florence, and yeah, it wasn't a great experience at all. And my wife actually works for a company based in Paris, and she complains about two things all the time. Every time she goes, every quarter, the airport and the food. And then generally, of course, I guess third would be the people, especially with the way that they can treat Americans. I think it's what I've heard is like really only in Paris where they take a little bit of an arrogant sort of like perspective of anybody who doesn't speak French. I think it's not just Americans.
Yeah, and I think if you don't get that, then you're missing out on the experience. So I think, that's part of Paris. You have to experience it.
It's pretty fun. Well, looking forward to getting back there, and I'll probably see you at the next KKR summit as well, too, Nabil. But so give us an idea of your perspective on kind of what you do, what the landscape is as you see it. And honestly, is it safe to say that insecure software is probably one of our biggest threats in this industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned earlier, I'm Nabil Hannan. I'm the field CISO at NetSPI. That being said, I do a lot of different things, but the biggest part of my job is really spending as much time as I can with our customers. And this is where I really work with them to solve difficult and challenging problems and make sure that I'm there as a strategic advisor who they can rely on to be a sounding board or just get guidance on how to approach problems that they're seeing. So most of my time is spent in front of customers. I travel quite a bit, as many people who know me will attest to. I'm almost on the road every week, and primarily because my customers are all over the world, and we help some of the largest companies in the world make sure that their software is secure. Now, with that being said, you bring up a good point. Is software ultimately the risk that we have to worry about? I think of it in two different ways. I think over time, everything is becoming more and more reliant on software, which is why I think software vulnerabilities and insecure software is so critical and an important part of day-to-day life for every person. Because if software misbehaves somehow, let's forget about vulnerabilities or bugs, if it just misbehaves somehow, it can really screw up someone's day. And I have a very good example of it that I like to use because I went through it myself, which is anyone who has lost their mobile phone or has had a mobile phone that just broke, that's when you realize how reliant you are on that mobile device and the software on that device for your day-to-day lives.
Sure.
In fact, if you enable multi-factor authentication on all your systems, all of a sudden you actually struggle to log back in because the easiest and fastest way to log in would be by having your device to get that second factor and that token or that approval notification on your device. And then as an extension of that, I personally, when I get a new phone or let's say do a fresh install of the software on my phone, I realize that I end up downloading, and I'm not exaggerating, around 120 different apps to go through my day-to-day activities. And for some people, I probably have more than others, but for most people, the number is probably above 50 if you think about it carefully, right? Between your banking systems, your different software that controls your TV or your thermostat, your Instacart order, your fast food delivery, your lock on your door, etc. Like all of these things require a separate piece of software that you now have to install in your device, and that causes a lot of problems. Now, to get to the second point of it, I actually think more important than software and vulnerabilities is actually the person. People are typically what's most important, because ultimately if you can have the most secure software in the world, but if the person using the software somehow gets social engineered or is somehow influenced by a different party, a nation state, or they're an insider threat, it doesn't matter how secure your software is, you're going to get compromised.
Which is so interesting because Patrick and I just finished a discussion with another guest specifically last week where we focused really entirely on the insider threat. She was a presenter at ThreatCon 1, our conference, and it was interesting to hear her sort of like, I forget what she called it, the cone of influence or the cone of something. And it was just kind of interesting hearing, how she's studied. She works for a financial services organization, how she studied human behavior and tried to understand it a little bit better. And then her goal is to apply that, or she's been applying that to her role in cybersecurity and trying to layer in things like OSINT and all types of like indicators to start to really understand, like from a fine grained standpoint, like what can we do better internally to enable employees, but to also kind of understand, where are we going to assign privileges? Where are we enabling access to, and to what, for what duration, right? Just like almost like totally governing policies from an employee and from a human standpoint. It was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and I'm not too surprised about the number of apps you mentioned, because when I did an audit, I got down to about 250, and that's after like removing the ones that I didn't need access to, like actually, cancellation of the account completely. So yeah, we are very reliant on technology in our lives every day.
And thinking about it from this standpoint too, while we're on the topic of software, Nabil, I mean, how far off are we really, like as an industry at large, from really applying the secure by design principles to the software that's going to be used in production in the enterprise? It seems like we're a ways off.
We are surprisingly ways off, given how long this has been a focus and how long we've been talking about this as being an issue. I think there are certain reasons why we are so off, and a biggest reason for that, I think, is connectivity and interconnectivity in particular.
Sure.
Everyone is building technology that is not built on the same standard software stack, right? You have something in Java, something in Python, something in COBOL, and they're all being somehow interwoven together to work together towards some sort of an outcome. And the second part of the challenge is we spent teaching in computer science the concepts of things like object-oriented programming to actually promote and enable reusability of software so that once you build something, you don't have to build it again. Now, the problem is people have started using things that were built for a certain objective, but then they end up using it incorrectly. So for example, if you go online and look for a random number generator and you happen to stumble upon one, you just download it and integrate it into your system without understanding what that was built for, you may not realize that, hey, you're using a random number generator that is not cryptographically secure, but you're using it for something that needs to be cryptographically secure or cryptographically random, right? If I build a random number generator for randomly selecting the background color of my web app, it probably doesn't need to be cryptographically secure. But if I open source it all of a sudden, I call it a random number generator, and someone who needs something for a different objective uses it, that causes a problem. We also have the challenge that nobody teaches how software breaks. If you think of any other engineering practice, you go to school to study that field of engineering, and they have classes that talk about every single possible failure that has happened. This bridge broke. Why did it break? This Mars rover crash landed into Mars. Why did it crash? Right?
Right.
It goes through every single failure scenario, and they teach you about failure. But for some reason, we teach people software engineering. We go give them some books on code and they can write up some code, whether it's secure or not. We don't care as long as it works. And then
Yep.
we go, great, you have your degree. Now you go build code in production, right? It's just because it's not a tangible, solid object that they're building. We all of a sudden have this biased view that probably doesn't need
Right.
to have as much of an integrity as a physical object would in any other field of engineering. So that causes a lot of problems. And then ultimately, it's a matter of the interconnectedness and complexity. Every company I talk to, if I ask them, hey, you know, from last year to this year, raise your hand if you have less code in your company than you did the year before, right? Nobody raises their hand. And guess what? The more code you have, the more bugs you have. The more bugs you have, the more problems you have. The more problems you have, the more vulnerabilities you have, right? The more scope you have for something to misbehave. And guess what we do after that? We still go connect that software to something else and expect it to still work without understanding the consequences. So
Exactly.
to truly build secure by design software, it's very hard and it requires a lot of focus, but it also requires you being very rigid in how you build software and what you connect your software to.
And that's interesting. And the reason it's interesting is you could make the case that someone's building software, so they go and get their degree, they finish school, they get a job out of college or whatever cert program they're in, and then they're up against an SLA from the company to deliver a specific piece of software on time, right? And why? Because if you're a software company, you need to go and sell that software. And if it works with its intended use, it seems like it's just like a good enough kind of thing where security is just going to slow it down.
Well, there's a second part of that too that gets more interesting. Not only do you have an SLA, but if you now ask for additional budget, whether it be dollars or time, to do something around security, technically you have nothing to show for it, right? So just because you made it more secure doesn't mean you have another button that a user can toggle, another feature that a user can use. And in fact, if you build it securely, technically nothing happens. So trying to convince someone to pay more money or spend more time to go do an activity that ultimately results in technically nothing happening is also hard. And that's what people struggle with.
It can even be a detractor because now it could be a more difficult end user experience. And then I do think that also if we separate ourselves from pure play like SaaS companies, a lot of software is built locally without the thought in the mind of that this thing is going to connect to the internet. But then that becomes a feature requirement for a multitude of reasons. And so the software we built in that where security was an afterthought, now we have to connect it to the internet. And I think that's a lot of times also what happens is now we increased our attack surface because we're putting software that wasn't designed to be on the internet on the actual internet. And that's very, very frequent, especially when you get into like healthcare, medical device, manufacturing, all those different verticals.
One thing that's interesting to be about your background is you've spent a lot of time. It's why we kicked off on the secure or insecure software subject. You spent a lot of time, right? Like at Sigil, Synopsys, before landing at NetSPI. Give us an idea of like how those things in software security influenced your jump into doing sort of, something different, with a slightly different. You've always advised clients, you've always been in an advisory role, but now at NetSPI, you take that with you. Like, what's the journey been like for you going from, in a couple of different roles that you've had, secure software, and now in NetSPI, you're not not only advising clients, but meeting with customers like large financial services companies, like on a regular basis. Give us an idea of how you got here.
I've been very fortunate throughout my career to get some unique opportunities that has allowed me to really get exposed to how a lot of these large companies deal with building security into their software. And as an extension, it leads to things like cloud security, network security, and so on. So I've been very fortunate that having stayed the software path, I got exposure to all these areas as well. And then being 20 plus years in cybersecurity industry, having seen and helped organizations evolve their programs for AppSec, NetworkSec, CloudSec, and see the different journeys and levels of maturity has really allowed me to better understand what the challenges are of trying to build software more securely. But the other part that often I don't talk about as much is before getting into security, I actually had a background in software development and product management. So having that level of insight into the challenges of building software, forget secure software, just building software that works and scales, gives me a different sense of appreciation, which then I can lead with empathy when I go work with these organizations to help guide them along their cybersecurity maturity journey. And I would say the one takeaway that I have from almost that's systemic across the industry is that most organizations seem to always want to go towards the shiny new object every time they find it there, without recognizing that you can't go after every shiny new object if you don't have your basics in place. Right? I was talking to someone as a joke. I was like, I can't become a pole vaulter by buying the best pole that I can go buy that money can offer. I have to actually have the basic skills of an athlete to go become a pole vaulter, right? I have to know how to run correctly. I have to know how to jump correctly. I have to know how to fall correctly before I go attempt something like that. But for some reason, organizations forget about the basics. They see the next new object and they want to go after it right away. And that causes a lot of the other problems too, because last thing you want as an organization is to feel like you're falling behind as a business because you're not leveraging the latest and greatest that's out there. So those are some of the key things I tend to find. Large financials or high-tech companies, all of them ultimately have some very similar challenges. I would say the biggest difference I see is more on the regulatory and compliance pressures. Different organizations and different industries will deal with different types of pressures from time to time.
If we look back to some of the, let's just say the largest projects that you've been involved in, and you're sitting down in front of a CISO and you're trying to help solve problems for them, right? What would you say is the biggest gap? Like if we're moving on from like the software and the insecure components around software and OS builds and compositions, what would you say is the single biggest gap that you've seen, not just like in the market, Nabil, but like think about you're at a table, you're in a conference room, you're talking to a CISO, he or she has a couple of like really good people in there, and you're talking about their security program and either perhaps where NetSPI fits in or just helping them solve problems in general. What's the biggest gap that you've seen to date in your career?
So there are maybe two or three different things that I see pretty consistently. The first one is a misalignment from what the leadership and the top CISOs are looking for versus the message getting diluted and you're playing a game of telephone versus what the operators on the ground are doing. And I have a really good example of this that I'll share in just a minute. The second piece of it is around people not understanding that if you don't measure the right things, then you end up asking the wrong questions. So when I go into an organization, I typically try to understand, well, what is driving your decision-making process, right? How do you know that you're investing in the right areas? How do you know where your gaps are, right? And what's your data that you're using to drive these decisions? Most often, they either don't have any data or if they do have data, they will refer to that data as metrics, but what they truly have are measurements. They're not metrics. And I like to define that clearly. For example, a measurement is, I could say, hey, I had 3 cups of coffee today. That's a measurement. But what a metric would be is, hey, after having 3 cups of coffee at noon today, my caffeine percentage in my blood was 0.001%, right? That's a metric. Now, both of these are very similar numbers, but if you give an executive that you had 3 cups of coffee, that leads them to asking different questions versus giving them your caffeine percentage in your blood. That leads to different types of questions. So similarly, often I notice that organizations are probably too immature to have the right metrics. And then when they're presenting the metrics in a certain way, they're asking the wrong questions because the metrics themselves are leading you to ask the wrong questions.
Yeah. How many we have 100,000 vulnerabilities that are all critical, right? I think a great example of something that would be used as a metric when it's in fact a measurement.
Yeah, but then the question you actually, if you're intelligent, you would say, okay, do we have 100,000 because it's one vulnerability that we just happen to have a spike in demand, so our cloud provider ended up deploying 100,000 servers, and that's why we have 100,000, but we have to fix just one? Or is it truly 100,000 vulnerabilities across 100,000 different assets that are all different, right? And it's hard to ask those questions if you don't have the right context, and that's exactly what happens many times.
Oh, I see it all the time. And I think in the vulnerability space, like, it's consistent. And then the other one you mentioned was communication, whether that's top down or across teams. But, always, I talk to people and they're like, oh, I have a challenge. I can't get people to do this work that needs to get done. And it's like, have you sat down with them, grabbed lunch and talked with them? It's like, no, I just send them an Excel spreadsheet and they don't do the work.
Right.
Yeah, and different interpretations and different priorities of things that happen between teams and then top down as well.
Well, let me give you my example, which I think it's probably one of the funniest conversation I've had in any executive readout to a CISO. So this was with one of the largest global financial institutions. They asked me to come in and they basically wanted to determine what their AppSec program needs to look like over the next 3 years. They're a very mature financial org. They do a lot of really good things, but they wanted to know, hey, what's the next step? How do I now go from where I am today to the next level? And I put together, the CISO directed his team. It was a couple levels down are the people I'm working with. I conducted like 70 interviews. I met with all the people across business units and different CIOs and app teams and so on and so forth. And I came back with a recommendation, which I first sent to the people who are more junior to review. They looked at me and they said, oh my God, you must be out of your mind. You're projecting a roadmap that's going to cost, let's throw out a number, that's going to cost $100 million. That will never work. We're in fact in a cost cutting initiative right now. You can maybe come in at 10 million. So why don't you go rework this and get the budget request in your roadmap down to 10 million? So I'm like, hey, that's what you want. That's fine. I'll go do that. Then we go and make those updates. Now we go present to the CISO. He looks at it and he goes, this needs to be at least 10 times more before I can even go ask my boss for a budget. Because if I go to her for a $10 million budget for AppSec, they're going to laugh at me. So I need the budget to be 10x more. And his team that were on that call, they were shocked. And luckily, one of them actually spoke up and said, Nabil's original budget was 100 million. We told him to cut it down to 10 million. So he basically said, just send me the original report, which is what we sent him. And he was very happy and moved on. But that's a very, very comical example, right? The CISO here is expecting a huge investment that needs to happen to transform their program. But down at the operator level, they have been so it's been ingrained in their brains that they have to cut cost and save money, and every dollar counts. They're not seeing that bigger picture, but somewhere between those levels, that message never permeated to those at the bottom. So that's a problem, and that causes a lot of issues across the board.
And to your point, Nabil, it's almost like they were conditioned in a certain way to behave a certain way, and just think about the priorities that are on their, daily or, weekly list at this point. And the reality is what your customer was looking for was something that was like 3 years out. How do we go and build this? And then on the back end of that, how do we back into what we want to be, or what defines success in that particular program?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a common problem. I will bet money if you go to like any Fortune 500 company and go talk to the CISO and ask them, hey, is budget a problem? If you have a security need, are you going to have trouble getting budget? I think they'll always tell you, if there's a need, I can go get the budget. Versus if you go ask a couple levels below them, hey, can you get budget for this? They'll be like, nope, sorry, budget's been set for the year already. Or they'll be like, nope, cannot add any more budget because that's all we have. That's always the case.
I got a question. Did the budget get approved?
It did. Yeah, I think the CISO actually went and asked for more than what was in the actual recommendation.
That's awesome. Well, going back to software, one of the topics that does come up pretty regularly with Patrick and I, both in our business at VulnCheck, but also on the podcast as well too, because it continues to be a topic that's got a lot of resonance to it, which is the CVE program. What are your thoughts? What's your perspective, right? There's been so much chatter about MITRE and CISA and like, can they hold on to this program, or, like what really truly needs to improve in the CVE program from your perspective, given the work that you do on a day in, day out basis?
Yeah, I mean, the CVE program, I think, is critical because it has become somewhat of a de facto standard of where people go to look for the common vulnerabilities that are out there and have an understanding and have a standardized inventory of what the issues are, how to exploit them, what's impacted, and so on and so forth, right? But ultimately, that is changing. And I think what we're realizing is organizations, as we talked about, how people get conditioned to do one thing one way and they don't change. I feel like the CVE program is becoming one of those things where organizations are becoming overly reliant on making decisions based purely on CVEs. We see this pretty heavily in the cyber insurance industry. So what happens is the cyber insurers, based on the data that they have, they typically can look at CVEs and determine what are the most common CVEs that they have to pay out claims against. And then what ends up happening is they go to their policyholders and say, you cannot have these CVEs. These CVEs are really bad, right? And they try to detect it for them. They try to work with them to remediate it and so on and so forth. But then what ends up happening is especially if the company that they're insuring isn't mature enough, they think that that's all they have to do. They think that what their cyber insurer is telling them, they take it more as strategic advice, and they don't think for themselves. They think that that's the bare minimum that they need to do, is look for those CVEs and move on. But that's clearly not enough, right? And then the second piece of this that I've only recently gotten some exposure to is many of my clients tell me they typically know about a CVE before it's published. So they know what technology is being impacted, and that typically sometimes it's a week or two or even longer, right? Which then tells me that there's some other problems where the CVE isn't current, but there's still opportunities to miss things, which means you still need to have different types of security initiatives, defense in depth, and other things to protect you against exploits, because you cannot just rely on the CVE list being accurate or being up to date at any given time, because there is a lag between when something gets identified and by the time it shows up in the CVE program.
Yeah, that's a topic on my front. It's like I'm always encouraging these vendors. It's like the CVE assignment is what gets consumed by all the downstream users. And it's kind of interesting because there is a small group of people that has a mentality that it's okay for things to be delayed. And I don't think they realize the real world impact that when you allow continual delays and you don't have accountability that things are done timely, that is the sole source that most programs consume data for. And it's an unfortunate reality, but that's where most people are getting the information to action on. And so ultimately, I'm a big advocate of the CVE program, but it's like, why wouldn't we want this information out quicker, faster, and in the hands of the defenders so they can actually take action on it? Sorry, I'm gonna get off my soapbox.
No, it's a very fair point. And ultimately, if I can wrap a bow around this one, right, is I think this also goes to show how government funding for cybersecurity is actually critical, especially if the US wants to stay ahead, because guess what? The adversaries themselves are not slowing down in any capacity. So, and you can't solely rely on other nations or other sources to make sure you're up to date on what's happening in the world. So actually having funding for different types of cybersecurity initiatives at the federal level, I think, is quite critical.
I would agree with that. I'm sure Patrick would too. Thinking about, all right, we've covered CVEs, we've covered software and the lack of the application of secure by design at critical mass. You spent a lot of time at Synopsys, and oftentimes when you're thinking about like the binary analysis of a software build, and in this case, if we're thinking about something like you referenced earlier, like a connected product, think about any connected product, all of the pieces of software that go into the composition and the compiling of that connected product, lots of third-party software, not a lot of first-party software. But thinking about it from like an S-BoM centric standpoint, Nabil, was that something that was part of your discussions with customers when you were at Synopsys, and then dating back to Cigital as well too? Give us an idea of like your thoughts, your perspective, like where do you find the S-BoM movement, as they say, going at this point?
Well, let me start off by saying not only was I involved and talking to people about this, but if you have the skin color that I have and you're on a plane and you're on a phone call talking about S-bombs, that also gets pretty shady pretty quickly. So I've also been in that situation where everybody on a plane that I just boarded was giving me dirty looks, and I didn't realize that I'm on a phone with someone talking about an S-bomb. And I have to very quickly start saying the whole thing about software bill of materials to make sure people were not freaking out about it.
I promise it's a software thing.
So yes, I was in some dicey situations for saying S-bomb, but yes, very involved in that whole process. I think organizations did not spend enough time focusing on making sure that they have easy access to their software bill of materials like they probably should. In fact, most organizations I dealt with, they really struggled when a customer or a regulator comes and says, give me your bill of materials. They struggle to get it to them because they don't have a current inventory and they don't have an automated way of getting to that inventory. That has evolved over time. And I think more and more organizations and engineering practices are now recognizing the need for that level of transparency when it comes to what is going into the systems that you're building. But I think there's another thing that's driving this, which is as we start evolving how software is built, over time, more and more software is really other people's software that is stitched together to do something versus really novel new code that is being written. In fact, that's actually a smaller percentage. And this is only getting accelerated with the adoption of things like the AI IDEs that help developers write even more code. And now you have code that often is functional and somehow works, but the developer who may have prompted to generate that code may not truly understand what that code is doing. And you have new types of vulnerabilities and risks that are getting introduced. So the whole concept of adoption of making sure you have the proper S-bomb is changing, but AI and AI-based IDs are introducing other complexities in that process that organizations are still trying to figure out how to approach.
Which is interesting and probably brings us into the AI topic, as we were getting here inevitably, Nabil. But So you and I met in Paris at the KKR CISO Summit. Your presentation was very AI centric, looking at specific things within AI and then specific ways to detect things like deepfakes and changes and graphics and things like that. It was like pretty fascinating and was one of the presentations that I was particularly interested in there. Give us an idea of where does AI play more broadly in like the cyber ecosystem today and your perspective on it, helpful, hindrance, both. And then give us an idea of like, some of the really interesting examples you gave were around like executive deepfakes and really trying to reduce that overall attack surface for organizations. I mean, I found it super cool. I'd love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, one of our heads of research for AI, he uses this quote often, and I really like it. He says, if it's built with math, it can be broken with math. So that's the number one thing when it comes to AI. And then I myself have a controversial thought on AI. I actually think artificial intelligence is named incorrectly. There's nothing truly intelligent about artificial intelligence. It's just software, and there's no sense of sentience in this piece of software, right? When I think of something that is intelligent, I think of it as having some level of sentience, which today's software systems still don't. We'll maybe get there someday, but we're not quite there yet. Now, to the human being who isn't as tech savvy or isn't building software or doesn't understand this, because AI can create such tremendously overwhelming high quality output in such a short span of time, to them it almost feels sentient. To them it almost feels super intelligent. And that's not the case. What I tell people is, think of LLMs in particular as being the most sophisticated autocomplete. That's what's really happening. It's just another form of autocomplete, but it's just very sophisticated. And it has a ton of training data that it can pull from. It has a ton of hardware power that it can run on and process things faster than humans can, and generate output way faster than humans can at a scale that humans would struggle to do. So that's the challenge you have with AI, is I think people often, just starting with the naming, they misinterpret what it really is. Ultimately, it's just software. Right. It's just a different type of software. The theory behind all this software existed 10, 20, 30 years for now, and we studied it. I studied it 20 plus years ago when I was in university, and that hasn't changed. What has changed is the cost and access to hardware that can process things to have it be meaningful and scalable. That has all of a sudden become accessible today. That just wasn't accessible 20 years ago. So that's kind of the baseline I like to set with people when we talk about AI. Now, the danger of AI that I think people maybe overcomplicate is, I actually don't think the danger of AI is in AI's capability to like go do something all on its own. So for example, if I tell one of the popular models, you pick like ChatGPT, Gemini, or whatever, Llama, and say, hey, go hack Tom's online bank for me and transfer some money to me, it's not going to know how to do that. Right? I can't give it unrealistic things and expect it to go figure it out. But if I ask it to generate an image of Tom doing something and I feed it enough training data of other pictures of you, Tom, it can probably generate something that looks quite realistic. Now, ultimately, where AI has become really powerful is in its ability to generate content that often is hard to distinguish between whether it's real or whether it's generated data. And then what's happening is it's playing with people's emotions in a way where we've started to recognize that a person, even if they recognize that what they're looking at is fake, they don't care as long as what they're seeing somehow emotionally aligns with how they feel about that particular topic. So, for example, I think at the conference we used this example where there was this like little girl clutching onto a puppy in the flood, right? And you know, the lady who posted this picture said, "My heart is aching because of something, right? Because of the picture." But then when people pointed out to her that this was a fake photo, she added a comment that says, I don't care that it's fake because I know that people are equally, if not more badly impacted by this flood. So it doesn't matter to me that the picture is fake. My feeling that it invoked in me is real. So I'm going to continue spreading this regardless of it being real or fake. And this is something people, I think, maybe underestimated, that thinking like, oh, if you know it's fake, maybe you won't propagate it. But the opposite's happening, right? You know it's fake, but if it aligns with your core values, you are more likely to propagate it even more. And that's how that information and misinformation and disinformation gets so far versus looking to determine the authenticity of the content itself.
Yeah.
And that's where I think AI is really having an impact today. And that's where it's causing a lot of the issues that we see with social engineering and misinformation and disinformation campaigns.
And it's such a like salient, tangible example too, Nabil, because when you think about like the scroll hours that people are logging today, like, you know, work ends and you're hanging around having a beer, just scrolling. Like, I'm sure that all of us have had a bunch of AI generated images and videos appear to us. One of the things that seems to be popular in my feed that Instagram keeps feeding me are people who are spending a ton of money and going on these African safaris, and they're out there and the lions are like super close to the safari, you know, vehicle, and they're there and there's one lady who's petting the lion, and then you see the lion come up and like drag the lady out, like, you know, basically off into, you know, the Serengeti somewhere. And if you're not watching it and you're not tuned in to like the quality of it or any particular little change, you probably think that was a real video because it looks so damn real. Then when you scroll and you move on, you're like, oh yeah, that had to have been fake. That had to have been an AI generated, you know, video that was served up to me.
And we're also starting to see certain categories or types of video that AI is really good at generating versus others, right? So for example, human hands are very hard for AI to generate correctly. But that being said, because there's so much trading data out there on things like surveillance video or your security camera video or your doorbell video, that it can actually generate content that is very hard to distinguish because there's so much training data out there, and they all are consistent, right? They're all framed correctly. They have the same type of metadata that show up whenever you see those videos and stuff like that. So that makes it harder to distinguish videos that have that type of characteristic to them versus the one example where it's like someone who may be just taking a video of us, pretending like they're taking a video at a safari. So we're also having to be mindful that some content is better than others, and ultimately it's a direct correlation of where is there more training data versus there isn't.
And then I think back to, okay, would someone actually be smart enough to, or dumb enough rather? Like, you just want to have more faith in humanity than to just go and, you know, touch a wild animal like that. And particularly with when there's a threat behind it, like maybe this helps us dovetail into our next question, Nabil, which is, what's the craziest thing that you've seen, or like what's the most severe type of threat that you've seen that AI was a significant part of so far, you know, in the, you know, short time frame generally that AI in cyber has been a thing?
I think the ability to use deepfakes to impersonate other people is probably one of the most dangerous things that's out there today, because if you think about all the population that is vulnerable who are not as tech savvy to truly understand whether something is a deep fake or not, that makes it worse. But then also, there are new technologies out there that allow you to, in real time, have conversations that sound like somebody else. Forget video for a second. The audio part is more critical because I can see my grandmother falling for it if someone called with my fake voice and said, hey, I'm in trouble, can you send me some money, right? I can see that panicking someone. Or I can see someone with maybe dementia. If you call pretending to be the police and say, hey, I'm coming to arrest you, I could see them freaking out and be more than happy to transfer over all their money and life savings that they have to avoid something like that. there's large parts of the population that are not like you and I, who are tech savvy, cybersecurity savvy, and we're up to date on this because that's what we live. We often forget that there's a large population that is still vulnerable. And I think that is what's happening with AI is the attackers are getting better at crafting better emails, talking more creatively, being able to fake an accent. So if they're talking to you in the US, they sound American, versus if they're talking to someone somewhere in Africa, they can simulate an African accent to make it sound more authentic. It's those types of things that are, I think, more dangerous and having a broader impact versus anything else like, hey, this type of attack is more popular. It's more of that social aspect of really taking advantage of people's human weaknesses, leveraging AI.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Well, Nabil, I have to say, this has been one of the more interesting conversations, and it sort of took a turn into AI. It was inevitable that we got there, but really fascinating perspective that you bring. But, what I think was really cool about it is you've got that practitioner level perspective on it because you're looking at threats all the time. You're looking at emerging threats. You're looking at helping your customers work through their security challenges. And I think it's interesting hearing from you is like you're in the field 3 out of 4 weeks of every month. You definitely see a lot.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it's inevitable, right? You see all of these things, and sometimes it's also very disheartening. That's something people probably don't talk about, right? We talk about how fun it is. Patrick wants a Thanksgiving 0 day to be published.
I didn't
We
say
talked about that earlier. Like sometimes we maybe over romanticize this experience of what we do. But sometimes you also, if you look at the true impact of people who are being affected by this, it's pretty disheartening and how like widespread this is. So I consider myself to be an eternal optimist, and my hope for AI is that we will leverage the power and the technology around LLMs and artificial intelligence to do good for the world versus doing bad. And I think that's what we need to focus on. I think generating deepfake videos are fun and great, but maybe we can accelerate some challenges around creating a cure for cancer, or figuring out how to build better, more nutritious food so we can cure world hunger or something like that. I feel like we're not focusing in the right spots.
I do think it's funny the silly use cases you're pointing out, right? Like have become the most popular of generating images or videos or other stuff. And maybe that's somewhat of a distraction as well to like, oh, wow, on the software side, that's where I spend most of my time looking at AI. And it's like 90% of these things can get fixed if there was data validation, automation, like basic stuff. Like you don't actually need AI to do it. It's that nobody's spending time on it.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting aspect as well is we're going to learn where is it really necessary and where does it actually just increase and create more tech debt.
Right.
And I think we're early on there, but I think there's, some examples being made right now as it relates to the software side. So
the biggest question it also represents is how do people find the time to go and put AI to use in these, mostly meaningless ways? And it's like, I mean, I know I don't have time to go and like make AI videos to go prank people and try to like cause some stir or something on Instagram. It's like I'm too busy working and parenting, and like where do people find the time to do all this stuff? It's crazy.
Well, that then leads to, there are lots of new revelations coming out, right? There are actual nation states out there that are funding these people to create misinformation and disinformation campaigns, right? So that's actually where it's coming from. They're normalizing the use of this type of misinformation so that at one point you don't know, or you struggle to really determine what is real versus what isn't. And that's the thing. It's not you and I, Tom, who have busy schedules, or Patrick, who has a busy schedule, that's going and doing this for fun. It's people who are actually getting paid by organized crime to go and do this for a very targeted reason.
It's wild. Well, Nabil, thank you for joining us today. This was an insightful discussion, super interesting perspectives.
Thank you.
Good luck with the rest of the year. We certainly hope to have you on here again. We definitely enjoyed it. I know the listeners will enjoy it. Stay tuned for our next episode of ThreatCon 1, a place to talk about emerging threats with the people who matter.